This committee will come to order. President Obama's race to empty the Guantanamo Bay detention facility is on. In recent weeks and months, many hardened terrorists have been released. Many of them have been sent abroad, and according to the President's closure plan sent to Congress last month, another 35 are set to be transferred this summer. Unfortunately, we know many of the recipient countries don't have the desire or commitment or even ability to monitor these dangerous individuals and prevent them from returning to the battlefield. Countries like Ghana and Uruguay aren't typical security and intelligence partners, but they are being asked to shoulder a heavy burden and a heavy responsibility. And there are real concerns about the administration setting aside intelligence assessments to deceive countries about the threat posed by the militants they are being asked to take in. That was certainly a finding of this committee, our investigation into the release of 6 detainees to Uruguay in December 2014. And I want to thank Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina, the chairman of our subcommittee that focuses on the Western Hemisphere. The top State Department official overseeing Guantanamo at the time wrote to the President of Uruguay that there was no information about these 6, there's no information that they were involved in conducting or facilitating terrorist activities against the United States or its partners or allies. No information? They were known to have been hardened Al-Qaeda fighters involved in forging documents, trained as suicide bombers, fighting at Tora Bora, committing mayhem, committing murders in Afghanistan. And although the law clearly states that steps must be taken to substantially mitigate the risk of released individuals from again threatening the United States, senior Uruguayan officials asserted before that these 6 arrived that they would not impose or accept any conditions to receive these former detainees. Indeed, these 6 terrorists were housed just blocks from the U.S. Embassy without the prior knowledge of U.S. officials and frankly were often seen outside of the embassy. The administration often talks of detainees cleared for release as if they are no longer a threat. But just over 30% of the detainees that have been released are either confirmed or suspected to have returned to the battlefield. Several of the senior leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula are alums of Guantanamo. The administration is emptying Guantanamo with the flimsy claim that it is a terrorist recruiting tool. Let me explain that I don't think that if you're standing in line in Raqqa to recruit into ISIS, you say, Guantanamo Bay is going to be closed. No need to enlist here. What Raqqa is about, what ISIS is about, is the establishment of the caliphate. That's what's driving recruitment, and frankly, the success of ISIS on the battlefield is driving recruitment. Closing this detention facility has been opposed by bipartisan majorities in Congress and even members of the President's own cabinet. It is no secret that former Secretary of Defense Hagel was pushed out in part because he was not certifying releases fast enough for the White House. Yet President Obama remains determined to push out as many terrorists as he can to other countries. 45 or so other law of war detainees would be moved to U.S. soil. Doing so could open a Pandora's box of legal issues, impairing our anti-terrorism efforts. Fortunately, any effort to bring Guantanamo detainees to U.S. soil would be, according to the Secretary of Defense, against the law. And that's also according to the Attorney General. I see no interest in changing that law, certainly not by the American people, and our laws must be honored. The White House, meanwhile, has no solid plans to detain and interrogate terrorists captured today. That's a problem. Indeed, the administration admits that its proposed domestic Guantanamo would not take in any new terrorists captured on the battlefield. If the administration was spending as much time working to capture and detain ISIS fighters as it was trying to close down this facility at Guantanamo Bay, we would be more secure. ISIS is continuing to threaten and expand in Libya and in Afghanistan and elsewhere across the globe. Europe is under siege by jihadists. We are under attack. So unfortunately, we are going to need a detention facility for fanatical terrorists whose processing in the U.S. legal system is unwarranted and simply is not feasible. And we're going to need that for some time to come. And we'll now go to an introduction of our panel. This morning we are pleased to be joined by Special Envoy Lee Wolosky. He's the Special Envoy for Guantanamo closure at the U.S. Department of State. Previously, he also served as the Director for Transnational Threats at the National Security Council under President Clinton. And we also have Special Envoy Paul Lewis for Guantanamo detention closure at the U.S. Department of Defense. And previously, Mr. Lewis served as both the General Counsel and Minority General Counsel at the House Armed Services Committee. And we welcome them both to the committee. We appreciate that our two witnesses, along with the intelligence community, have already agreed to meet with the committee in April in closed session on necessary classified issues. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record, and members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any questions or any statements or extraneous material for the record. And at this time, I would like to go to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York, who is the ranking member of this committee, for his opening statement here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. And gentlemen, Mr. Wolosky, Mr. Lewis, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and thank you for your service. We're reminded again today of the terrible cost of violent extremism. I was just on the floor of the House speaking on a resolution declaring our solidarity with the people of Belgium. So that's why I just got here. Came here right from the floor. The dark shadow of a terrorist attack has fallen over another of Europe's great cities, and we're all standing alongside the Belgian people today as they mourn the dead, heal the wounded, rebuild what's been broken, and seek justice. In these situations, it's important to look at what more we can be doing to enhance cooperation with our partners and prevent this type of violence. It's also important to reflect on where our policies have gone astray and maybe made the situation worse. So it's appropriate today that we're taking a hard look at one of the most troubling and divisive symbols of our counterterrorism effort, the Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility. The subtitle of today's hearing is "What are the foreign policy and national security costs of closing the Guantanamo facility?" But as policymakers, legislators, and experts have been saying almost since the facility opened, the better question perhaps may be, what are the costs of keeping it open? For starters, the prison's a drain on military resources. It costs nearly $5 million a year to keep a person detained at Guantanamo versus $78,000 a year to hold someone in our most secure federal prison. Closing Gitmo and transferring detainees to other secure prisons would free up $85 million a year, resources we could put to better use elsewhere combating terrorism. The argument against this goes, we need to spend whatever it costs. These guys are too dangerous to bring here. But let's look at that. Today, 91 detainees remain in Gitmo. Since the prison opened, 644 individuals have been transferred out, 144 under President Obama and 500 under President Bush. As of today, more than a third of the current detainees have been cleared for release after a thorough review process. Under no circumstances will these people be released onto American soil. Like all the others, they will be transferred directly to other countries. Prior to 2009, more than 1 in 5 released detainees returned to the battlefield, but improved procedures under the Obama administration have nearly eliminated this problem. If the President plans to close the Guantanamo detention, if the President's plan to close the Guantanamo detention facility goes forward, only a handful of detainees would ever be brought to the United States, and those who are would be held in supermax prisons. They're called supermax prisons for a reason. No one has ever escaped from one. And who are some of the current residents of these incredibly secure facilities? Terrorists. Zacarias Mousai, who helped plot September 11, 2001 as a New Yorker, something that I'll never forget. Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. 4 men behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. 6 terrorists responsible for bombing our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. All these men will call ADX Florence in Colorado home for the rest of their days. For the very few prisoners still in the military commission process, we should try them in federal court and speed justice for their victims. If there's any doubt whether our justice system can handle the most dangerous terrorists, ask any of the people I just listed. This isn't a question of what rights Guantanamo detainees should or shouldn't be accorded. It's just a simple fact that the federal justice system has tried and punished terrorists much more effectively than military commissions. But beyond the dollars and cents, beyond our safety here at home, we need to consider the harm Gitmo has inflicted on our security interests around the world, and just as importantly, on our values. For terrorists seeking to recruit more fighters into their ranks, the Guantanamo facility is a gift that keeps on giving. This prison has become so infamous and so reviled that our enemies no longer even need to call it by name. Instead, as we've seen again and again, terrorists flip on a camera so the whole world can see, parade out some innocent prisoner dressed in an orange jumpsuit, and cut off his head or light him on fire. The orange jumpsuits weren't selected by accident. Everyone knows what they symbolize. This prison has helped strengthen our enemies. It has become a stumbling block in our relationship with coalition partners. After all, it's not just Americans that ISIS is dressing in those orange jumpsuits, and it has created deep division here at home. And that's because Gitmo has long strained some of our country's most important values. It has become synonymous with torture and indefinite detention. When we were going to school and learned all about rights and the Constitution, this was never allowed under American law. So I want to quote retired Major General Michael Leonard, the first commander of the detention facility after 9/11. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Guantanamo was a mistake. History will reflect that. It was created in the early days as a consequence of fear, anger, and political expediency. It ignored centuries of rule of law and international agreements. It does not make us safer, and it sullies who we are as a nation." So I ask unanimous consent that Major General Leonard's full statement be included in the record.
Without objection.
So coming back to our, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So coming back to our question, what are the costs of closing Guantanamo? To me, the answers are clear. The costs of closing the facility are far, far less than the cost of keeping it open. I'm not alone in this view. President George W. Bush was very clear that he wanted to close Gitmo. John McCain made a campaign promise to do the same. An overwhelming majority of national security and military experts, including former secretaries of state and defense, CIA directors, national security advisors, and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, think it should be shuttered. As I've pointed out, the arguments against closing it just don't hold up. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, the only justification for keeping the prison open is fear. Fear of violent extremism, fear that our justice system or prison system cannot get the job done, despite all the evidence to the contrary. And fear is precisely what our enemies want to instill in us. I don't want them to win. We shouldn't allow that. We should clean up the stain on America's commitment to justice and democracy. We should take away this propaganda tool for terrorists. We should work to implement the President's plan and shut down this prison. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Everyone who knows me knows that I take a very hard line on this, but I think that we are far better off closing this facility for our interests, no other interests, our American interests, than if we leave it open. So I look forward to hearing our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, good morning. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you this morning to discuss the important matter of closing Guantanamo Bay, Cuba's detention facility. I'm honored to be joined today by my colleague, Paul Lewis, Special Envoy for Guantanamo detention closure at the Department of Defense. Today, I'll describe the rigorous processes that determine whether a detainee should be approved for transfer and the extensive interagency efforts that ensure compliance with applicable statutory requirements before each transfer takes place. At the outset, let me emphasize that President Obama concluded that the continued operation of the Guantanamo detention facility damages our national security for many of the same reasons that led President George W. Bush to the same conclusion. According to President Bush, by his second term, and I quote, "The detention facility had become a propaganda tool for our enemies and a distraction for our allies," close quote. It remained so when President Obama took office, and it remains so today. The bipartisan view that Guantanamo should be closed is not limited to Presidents Bush and Obama. Senator John McCain has said that he is in favor of closing Guantanamo. Likewise, former Secretaries of State Clinton, Royce, Powell, Albright, Christopher, Baker, and Kissinger have all advocated closing Guantanamo. So too have 3 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and 42 retired generals and admirals. The list goes on. In addition to leading Democrats and Republicans, world leaders and international organizations, from the Pope to the Organization for American States, consistently call on the United States to close Guantanamo. Today, there are 91 individuals detained at Guantanamo, down from a peak population of 680. Altogether, a total of 779 detainees have passed through Guantanamo, and of those, 688 have departed. The vast majority of detainees transferred out of Guantanamo to other countries, some 532, were transferred before President Obama took office on January 20th, 2009, prior to the implementation of rigorous interagency procedures that were implemented by this administration and are described more fully in my written testimony. My written testimony describes at length the 2 processes by which this administration has approved detainees for transfer. What they have in common is rigorous review and analysis of all available information in the possession of the U.S. government, and the unanimous agreement of 6 agencies and departments before a detainee may be designated as approved for transfer. After a detainee is approved for transfer, the Department of State leads negotiations with foreign governments about possible transfer. We're joined in our efforts by colleagues from the Department of Defense, Justice, and Homeland Security, as well as by those in the intelligence community and on the Joint Staff. The decision as to whether, when, and where to transfer a detainee is the culmination of a rigorous interagency process, similar to the initial decision to approve a detainee for transfer. This process, including the process by which we negotiate security assurances with our foreign partners, is described at length in my written testimony. I look forward to your questions about it. Once we arrive at a satisfactory security framework with a foreign government, the Secretary of Defense seeks concurrence in the transfer from the in a specific transfer from the Secretaries of State and Homeland Security, the Attorney General, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Only after he receives the views of those principals, and only after he is satisfied that the requirements of the National Defense Authorization Act are satisfied, does the Secretary of Defense sign and transmit a certification to the Congress conveying his intent to transfer a Guantanamo detainee. The rigorous approval and negotiation process I've described have contributed to the dramatic reduction in the confirmed re-engagement for detainees transferred during this administration. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak before you about this important issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Lewis.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm honored to join my colleague Lee Woloski. And Mr. Chairman, I particularly appreciate your continued and sustained interest in this extremely important issue. At the outset, I want to echo Special Envoy Woloski's statement and make one fundamental point regarding the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. The President and his national security team have determined that closing this detention facility is a bipartisan national security imperative. The President has repeatedly stated that the continued operation of the detention facility at Guantanamo weakens our national security by damaging our relationships with key allies and partners, draining resources, and providing violent extremists with a propaganda tool. In January of last year, 42 retired military leaders, all retired general officers or flag officers, wrote the leadership of the Senate Armed Services Committee and forcefully argued for the closure of this facility, stating the issue of what to do with Guantanamo is not a political issue. There is near unanimous agreement from our nation's top military, intelligence, and law enforcement leaders that Guantanamo should be closed. This letter was signed by General Charles C. Krulak, a retired Commandant of the Marine Corps, Major General Michael Leonard, the first commander of the Joint Detention Task Force at Guantanamo, General Joseph Hoare, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, General David Maddox, the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, and many other leaders. Many of these leaders reaffirmed this letter this month. As Lee noted, in addition, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, and General Martin Dempsey support Guantanamo closure. It's the opinion of many others in our military. Envoy Woloski has noted the bipartisan support for Gitmo closure, but I think it's important to highlight this broad conclusion. This conclusion is shared by 2 presidents, 4 former secretaries of defense, 8 former secretaries of state, and it demonstrates this bipartisan support at the highest level of our national security leadership. As Envoy Woloski noted, in his memoirs, President George W. Bush himself concluded that the Guantanamo detention facility was a propaganda tool for our enemies and a distraction for our allies. The President himself made this statement. And as President Obama recently noted, by 2008, it was widely recognized that this facility needed to close. This was not my opinion. This is the bipartisan support to close it. As the Special Envoy for Guantanamo detention closure, my primary focus is on the transfer process. 16 detainees have been transferred to date in 2016. These transfers have reduced the Guantanamo detention facility's population to fewer than 100 for the first time since 2002. Overall, 27 nations since 2009 have accepted Guantanamo detainees who are not from that prospective country. In addition, 13 other countries or territories have accepted repatriation of their own citizens since 2009. As with our military leaders, foreign leaders regularly cite the Guantanamo detention facility as an obstacle to counterterrorism efforts. In my written statement, I cite several statements. Cliff Sloan, Envoy Woloski's predecessor, noted an example. As a highly ranking security official from one of our staunchest allies on counterterrorism once told me, the greatest single action the United States can take to fight terrorism is to close Guantanamo. And I note highlights by other counterterrorism experts from the previous administration, John Bellinger and Matt Waxman, who both worked for the Department of State, noted the counterterrorism effects of not closing Gitmo, and I described those in more detail in my opening statement. Mr. Chairman, I'm also prepared to address the plan to close the Guantanamo detention facility. The President, announcing the plan, stated that it has 4 main elements. We'll continue to transfer, we'll accelerate the PRB process, we'll look for individual dispositions, and most importantly, we'll work with Congress to find a location to transfer everybody from Guantanamo safely and securely. As far as the transfer process, I just want to state that Secretary Carter has forcefully stated that safety is his #1 priority. He does not transfer a detainee unless he is confident that the threat is substantially mitigated and it's in the national security interests of the United States. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the military service members conducting detention operations at Guantanamo Bay. Too often in the course of considering the future of this facility, we lose sight of the remarkable men and women who serve honorably under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They have our deepest appreciation for their service and their professionalism, which they display each and every day on behalf of our nation. Gentlemen, President Bush worked towards closing Guantanamo. Many officials in his administration worked hard towards that objection. We're closer to it than many people realize. Of the nearly 800 detainees who have been held at Guantanamo since the facility opened, over 85% have been transferred, including more than 500 that were transferred by the previous administration. The President, his national security experts, and this administration believe it should be closed. The senior military leaders of this country and the leaders of the Department of Defense concur. As indicated in the letter by the retired military leaders, many believe the closure of this facility is the single most important counterterrorism effort the United States can undertake. We believe the issue is not whether to close the Guantanamo detention facility, it's how to do it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me ask both our witnesses. Secretary of Defense Carter and Attorney General Lynch have both stated that transfers of Guantanamo detainees to the United States are legally prohibited. Is that your understanding of the law as well?
It's my understanding of the law that that the statute, in its current form, prohibits transfers to the United States, which is why we are working at this time with the Congress, or seeking to work with the Congress, to modify the law in order to be able to bring into the United States a small, irreducible minimum number of detainees, as described in the President's closure plan.
Is it correct then that under current law, the Department of Defense is prohibited from selecting any U.S. site or making any preparations for transfer of detainees to the U.S.?
Frankly, I have no idea. That is a legal question that is most appropriately directed to the Department of Defense.
Mr. Lewis?
Mr. Chairman, we believe detainees can be safely and securely and humanely detained in the United States. I believe the current statute does prohibit us from doing that, so we are working towards doing that. The plan that was sent up, we gave a look at locations, military facilities, and federal and state facilities that could do that. We believe detainees, as I said, can be detained. We did not pick a specific location.
One of the concerns that Congress clearly has here is that in terms of our experience with those who have left Guantanamo Bay, over the long haul, those who have returned to the fight or those who are suspected of having returned to the fight is a little over 30%. I understand the argument that the administration is making that recent individuals released, they haven't returned. There's a lower percentage that return to the fight, but of course there's a continuum in terms of collecting the information and monitoring and transitioning as people end up. I'm just looking at the overall number. The overall number is in the neighborhood of 31%. And if we begin to focus on some of the recent examples of those who did, it is pretty concerning, given Ibrahim El Kozi. He was one of the high-risk detainees transferred by this administration, and by 2014, he had joined Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and now he is in their leadership. And last month, we saw a video urging a takeover in Saudi Arabia. Now, he would not be out doing his propaganda if he were housed in Guantanamo. And one of the concerns I have about the rap sheet on those inside as we make the argument, and we've been through these discussions, but we make the argument about the necessity of releasing them. But the fact is, the bottom line is, they end up, a certain percentage of them, pulling stunts like this, calling for the overthrow of the government in Saudi Arabia and very engaged in that process. And so, in terms of I understand the theory that it's a recruitment tool, that thesis. But the fact is that a significant percentage returned to the fight, and we have an unclassified letter to Congress last month from the Director of National Intelligence, writing that the intelligence community lacks reporting that Guantanamo propaganda has motivated more recent ISIS recruits to join the group. So there is a debate. I've certainly talked to former administration high-ranking officers and officials who have the opposite view of the view that you've laid out today, who tell me, no, they don't think it has to do with recruitment. We understand your theory on it, but there is the fact. And the fact is that we do have this process. So let me ask you this question. We do have this challenge because of the way this process is releasing individuals to countries that don't have the capability. So here's my question. Mr. Lewis lists in his testimony some of the countries that the administration has transferred detainees to since 2009. So, Mr. Lewis, El Salvador, Kazakhstan, Ghana, and I would just ask, Lee, have you been to Ghana? Now, this is one of the countries that I've been to. Are you fully confident that it has the capability and motivation to monitor and track these detainees?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we are. As you know, no transfer occurs unless we are confident in the security assurances that we've received, and the Secretary of Defense makes the requisite certifications to the Congress. To date, and we only have, admittedly, several months of experience, what I can tell to you, say in this open forum, and we're happy to come and brief you in closed session, is that we are very pleased by the implementation by the government of Ghana of the security assurances that have been agreed to.
As I say, I've been to Ghana and across West Africa. Ghana is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful country. But the fact is that it doesn't have top-notch intelligence or law enforcement services to deal with this kind of problem. The GDP per capita is like $4,000. It's 175th in the world. The fact is that their leaders have many, many challenges in Ghana, facing them every day. So I'm going to guess that tracking and monitoring former Guantanamo detainees isn't a priority, just as it wasn't in other examples that I've laid out for you, like Uruguay. It just wasn't a high rank, up there. And if they weren't returning, or if 31% of them hadn't returned to the fight, this wouldn't be a concern, Lee. But this is a very real concern. I'll go to Mr. Engel for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, emotionally, because of terrorism and the attacks on 9/11 and the attacks in Brussels and things that we're hearing, emotionally, you just want to say, well, throw them all in jail and put them all in jail and throw away the key. But that's not how we're supposed to work as a nation. That's not what we stand for. And I don't believe that we should abandon our principles if we can still be safe. I would say that things are a trade-off. I wouldn't be for abandoning our principles if it meant that there was going to be a larger chance of being unsafe as a result of releasing or transferring some of these people. But when you read the facts and you look at the facts, you see that it's really worse by keeping them there, if you have a balance sheet. Now, I'm not for releasing anybody who was guilty. But I'm also not for keeping people in prison year after year after year after year with no trial. That's not what I learned when I was in grade school about one of the reasons why this country is so great. Opponents of closing the Guantanamo detention facility often say that the people currently in the prison are the worst of the worst or the most dangerous, and that's why we should not release them at all. Some critics point to risk assessments from the previous administration, from the Bush administration, in support of this claim. What's your view of how risk assessments have been conducted by the Interagency Task Force and the Periodic Review Boards compared with previous risk assessments? And given what you know about detainees currently held at Guantanamo, are they really the most dangerous? And if not, why have they been in Guantanamo for so long? Is it because we've already transferred all the easy cases? Explain how these people are vis-a-vis cases that have already been adjudicated.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. It's certainly the case that there are some extremely dangerous individuals who remain in Guantanamo, but it's also the case that there are individuals in Guantanamo who are not extremely dangerous. Of the 36 that are currently approved for transfer, 29 are Yemeni nationals, and of course, we've been unable to return them to Yemen. Returning them to the country of origin is always our first choice in removing a Guantanamo detainee from Guantanamo. So there is a significant component of country of origin that goes into the remaining detainee population and why they are still there. With respect to your first question, it sort of bleeds into the re-engagement issues that the chairman raised, which I appreciate the opportunity to address, because we actually do have hard data on re-engagement, and I'd like to refer you to the numbers in the report issued by the Office of Director of National Intelligence earlier this month on re-engagement. The actual numbers are, in this administration, 7 confirmed re-engagement former detainees. In the previous administration, 111. 7 in this administration out of 144 transferred. That translates into 4.9%. The number for the previous administration is 111 out of 532, which translates into 20.9%. We believe that this data affirms that the procedures that we have put in place during this administration have worked to substantially reduce any re-engagement concerns. And I also think that you're exactly right when you indicated in your opening statement that the risks of transferring detainees, and we've acknowledged that there are risks, must be weighed against the risks of keeping the facility open. There has been, until recently, a bipartisan consensus that there are significant national security and foreign policy risks associated with keeping the facility open. That was articulated by the previous president, who transferred over 500 detainees out of Guantanamo in furtherance of his effort to close Guantanamo because he recognized that it was a propaganda tool. The conclusion was also reached by nonpartisan military leaders across the services. So I think that when we talk, and I'll stop speaking in a moment, when we talk about re-engagement, it is important to refer to the actual data that has been put forward by the Director of National Intelligence.
Well, let me ask you, who's left at Guantanamo? Is it correct that 91 individuals, of the 91 individuals who remain at Guantanamo, 81 are not facing criminal charges? Is that true? And is it also correct that 35 individuals have been cleared for transfer out of Guantanamo So what does that mean to be transferred out? Who decides? How long have they been cleared for transfer, and why are they still waiting to leave?
Thank you for your question. There are 91 detainees in Guantanamo. 36 have been approved for transfer. Some of them have been approved for transfer since 2010, some of them more recently. 10 have been, are in some portion, some stage of the military commission process, either facing charges or serving sentences. And the remainder, 40 some odd detainees, are neither approved for transfer nor currently facing charges.
Can I, Mr. Chairman, if you just indulge me, I just want to quickly ask a federal court question, because the administration's plan calls for some Guantanamo detainees to be tried in the U.S. federal courts, and Congress has imposed a ban on transferring any Guantanamo detainees to the U.S. for any reason, including for trial. But from what I can see, federal courts have been extremely effective at trying terrorism cases. Since 9/11, federal courts have convicted over 500 people on terrorism-related offenses, and by contrast, the 9/11 Military Commission trial has been in pretrial hearings since 2012. So the trial itself is not expected to start until 2020. So why have the federal courts, in your opinion, been so much more effective at bringing these terrorists to justice?
Well, the federal courts are a proven mechanism for both convicting and then making sure that convicted felons serve time safely and responsibly. You're right. There are numerous terrorists who have been effectively convicted and are now serving time in the federal prison system. Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, Mr. Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, Moussaoui, the list goes on. They all have been held safely and securely. Back to the point that the chairman raised about Mr. Al-Kosi, I should point out that he was released from the custody of the United States after serving his military commission sentence. So he is an example of someone who went through the military commission system, was pled guilty to material support and conspiracy, and then after he served his sentence in that system, he was released. If he were put through the Article 3 system, he would probably still be serving his sentence and not be off doing what he's been doing.
If I could, we're talking about two different sets of numbers, so if I could just address that quickly before we go to the next member. In terms of the administration's numbers that they released, the administration's claim is 7.9% of detainees released under the President are confirmed or suspected of re-engaging in terrorism. You're just using the number confirmed, and the administration released the figure that overall the rate is just over 31%. Investigators tell us that it takes 4 years to confirm. So there is a question in terms of the trend line on detainees recidivism, but the overall rate that I'm quoting here is the rate on confirmed or suspected. And we'll go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome both of you to the committee. Yesterday, I chaired an oversight hearing on focusing on the 14 countries that Reuters found after a series of investigative reports. And I want this on the record, and I hope the press would take notice of this, because I think it's an egregious flaw in our implementation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which I am the author of. I am deeply concerned that Cuba's Tier 3 State Department ranking, which is the worst, it had been there during the Bush administration, had been so designated during the Obama administration, only to be manipulated politically for non-human trafficking criteria in anticipation of this rapprochement, which I find absurd. The TIP report should be absolutely accurate and speak truth to power and defend those who have been, are you bored with this?
No, no, sir.
Thank you. You should speak truth to power when it comes to sex trafficking and child sex tourism, which is rampant, and the Castro regime gleans enormous profits from it, as they do from labor trafficking. And we have an upgrade which takes them off the sanctions list, which I find to be appalling. Yesterday, one of our witnesses pointed out that the Cuban government is likely one of the largest and most profitable trafficking promoters in the entire world. So my hope is that this year, and yesterday's title of our hearing was "Next Time, Get It Right," that there will be no political manipulation of the trafficking tiers. If you read the report itself, it reads inescapably to a Tier 3 sanctions rating. But when it got to another level, there was a manipulation there for political reasons, and I find that appalling and deeply, deeply saddening. Let me just ask you a question on point. The point man in Uruguay, as we all know, for overseeing the 6 transferred Guantanamo detainees is the Minister of Interior, Eduardo Bonami. Are you confident in Minister Bonami's commitment to ensuring that the former detainees do not link up with international Islamic terrorist networks, or ensuring that these 6 individuals do not threaten our embassy personnel or American nationals in Uruguay? In other words, do you trust Eduardo Bonami and believe that he is a man of honorable character?
Well, thank you for your question, Congressman. I don't know him, but what I can say is that we are confident. There's never, as I said, there's never no risk associated with transferring a detainee. The appropriate calculus, we believe, is the one essentially that Congressman Engel put forward, which is weighing the risks of transferring versus the risks which have been recognized across the spectrum of maintaining the facility. But we are confident, to your question, that the government of Uruguay is taking appropriate steps to substantially mitigate the risk associated with each of the 6 detainees that have been transferred to its custody.
Again, is it your view that the minister, this particular minister, an avowed leftist, is trustworthy?
Well,
because he's the guardian.
I don't agree with that necessarily. When we look at countries to resettle detainees in, we do not base it on personalities. We base it on the government as a whole, the capabilities of the government as a whole, and the willingness of the government. And then, of course, the specific security assurances that have been negotiated and our assessment of whether or not those security assurances can and will be implemented.
But since he is likely to be the point man, or is the point man, could you provide, for the record at least, your analysis as to his trustworthiness?
I can't, because I don't know him. But again, when we look at transfer opportunities, we base our conclusions on the capabilities of a government.
But he is the point person for the government.
He may be now. He may not be tomorrow. And so we don't rely on particular personalities. Is sort of the bottom line.
I understand, but with all due respect, personnel is policy, and if a government has a person walking point on a particular issue like this one, and it happens to be this Minister of Interior, I think we would want to know whether or not he is a person who can be trusted, particularly with such people who have committed terrorism and may recommit.
Well, again, as I said, I have not met him, so I feel uncomfortable offering a personal assessment. And what we do is we base our decisions on governments as a whole.
But again, that's why, for the record, if you could provide an additional amplification of those who analyzed the situation and felt comfortable enough to proceed with this vis-a-vis this particular minister.
The Department of State felt comfortable.
But if you could provide us that analysis in follow-up answer.
Just to be clear, what the analysis of?
Yeah, and we could do a lot of that by follow-up answer, because we need to go to Mr. David Cicilline and get through a lot of members here. Mr. Cicilline, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. The title of this hearing refers to the foreign policy and national security costs of the administration's plan to close Guantanamo Bay, the detention facility. However, the vast majority of national security leaders as you both indicated, as well as leaders on both sides of the political spectrum, say that the real foreign policy and national security costs come as a result of keeping the prison open, and in fact describe it as the closing of Guantanamo Bay detention facility is a national security imperative. And so I'd like you to speak to how the administration's plan to close Guantanamo Bay detention facility will impact our ability to work with our coalition partners in the fight against terror, and how the failure to close it is providing a real impediment to that critical work.
Thank you, sir. As I noted in my opening statement, continuously countries across the world and allies tell us that Gitmo hurts us. So we work with those countries. By closing Gitmo, we address a concern of the rest of the world. The United States needs to lead. We can't do this alone. And when our allies in counterterrorism are telling us that Gitmo needs to be closed, we take an issue off the table. We don't remove the risk completely. It's always going to be a propaganda issue, but we take that issue off the table.
And does the presence of Guantanamo Bay have an impact on our ability to use diplomacy and soft power to press other countries to uphold human rights obligations, including responsibilities against torture, forced disappearance, arbitrary or indefinite detention, things that we speak about with other countries, and has our credibility been harmed by the continued indefinite detentions at Guantanamo Bay and the opening of this facility?
Yes, sir, I believe it does. As the President noted in his statement last month, leaders that he meets with continuously raise the issue of Gitmo. They continuously raise the issue of specific detainees. Lee's predecessor, Cliff Sloan, mentioned how he's been told by foreign leaders that closing Gitmo would be the single greatest issue to help our counterterrorism efforts, and repeated leaders from both this administration and the previous administration have said the same. So I think it does hurt us.
And with respect to the 36 detainees that have been approved for transfer, some since 2010, what is taking so long for that to be completed?
Well, as Lee said, most of them are Yemenis. 29 are Yemenis, so we can't confidently send them to Yemen right now. So we have to go look at this list of 27 other countries that have stepped up and find a fit for that detainee, find a fit for the security situation in the country, their willingness and their capacity. So it's a mixture of sequencing, it's a mixture of the domestic issues in the country, but 27 countries demonstrates that there are countries that want to help us and are willing to step up. And we are confident that the majority of these 36 can be transferred in the next several months.
Thank you. And with respect to the issues with regarding re-engagement, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence categorizes these re-engagements in 3 different ways for at least purposes of this hearing. 17.5% of detainees have re-engaged, but if you break that number down, prior to this president, prior to January of 2009, the number was 20.9%, but since President Obama, the figure is 4.9%. So, Mr. Woloski, will you explain, are those figures accurate? What do they represent? And how do you account for this dramatic reduction in re-engagement, which is critical? I mean, those are, obviously, any re-engagement is alarming, but the fact that it's been brought to 4.9% from 20% didn't happen just by magic. There has to have been some change in process. Would you speak to that?
Sure, sir. Yeah, there have been many changes in process that have been put in place in this administration, from the actual decision to approve someone for transfer, which is a complicated, time-consuming, very thorough, and very rigorous interagency process, and only moves forward with the consent of each of 6 agencies and departments, to then the actual decision to transfer and approve for transfer a detainee to a specific country, which again is a rigorous interagency process that entails the negotiation of detailed and quite specific security assurances with a specific country, and then ultimately input from the same 6 agencies and departments, and then congressional notification by the Secretary of Defense. So Our process is very thorough, it's very rigorous, it's very time-consuming, further to your question about why things have taken so long. And we believe that, again, there's never no risk, but we believe that the relative success of our processes are reflected in the re-engagement figures when you look at the small figure in this administration and the larger figure in the previous administration.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rohrbacher.
Well, the first question I'd like to ask, I think it'd be answered with a yes or no. It's, has the Defense Department ever knowingly transferred a detainee to a country that did not exhibit an ability to substantially mitigate the risk or maintain control of that individual? I think a yes or no could be, that's a very straightforward question. No. Has the Defense Department ever sent someone to a country knowing that that country was unable to keep control of that person?
No.
Well, I'm not from the Defense Department, but I'm assuming that your question relates to this administration while that was the statutory standard.
Actually, it doesn't. Do you know of any examples?
I can't speak for the previous administration, certainly.
Okay, well, what about this administration? Can you speak that whether or not that the Defense Department has transferred a detainee to someone who, is there some reason that you can't say yes or no?
Well,
I don't
I
work-
represent the Department of Defense.
All right.
So,
But
sir, what I can tell you is,
let's leave it at knowingly. Do you know of a case where the Defense Department has knowingly transferred a detainee to a country that did not exhibit the ability to substantially mitigate the risk by maintaining control of the individual? Do you know of a case like that?
I do not.
Okay, that's.
sir, the statutory standard is substantially
It's all right,
mitigate.
it's all right.
Yes, sir.
You made your answer. Let me just suggest that this idea that people throughout the world are going to be so upset with us for keeping a significant number of people who were captured as part of terrorist units, incarcerating them in Guantanamo. That's such a horror story that it's a recruitment vehicle. That's what the president is telling us. That's what the administration is telling us. Let me suggest, if that is true, that our European allies and some others believe that taking these hardened murderers who murder men, women, and children and incarcerating them on Cuba or anywhere else, let me suggest that attitude of our European friends may well be changing in the next 6 months or so when they realize that the slaughter that's taking place in Paris and now in Brussels is part of an international movement to destroy Western civilization and replace it with a caliphate. And when they understand that, my guess is that view that it's so bad to keep these people in prison will change as well. Let me ask you this. We say that about 30% or whatever that figure is that have been released have returned to terrorist activities. How many lives have been lost by those terrorists who went back to their terrorist activity? How many lives?
I can talk about that in a classified setting, but
Oh, classified.
yes,
Oh, so is it over 10?
sir, what I can tell you is, unfortunately, there have been Americans that have died because of Gitmo detainees.
How many Americans have to die? How many people in Brussels or Paris have to die, civilians? What's the threshold at that point? Well, maybe we will keep them under control in Gitmo.
Sir, when anybody dies, it's a tragedy, and we don't want anybody to die because we transfer detainees. However, it's the best judgment and the considered judgment of this administration and the previous administration that the risk of keeping Gitmo open is outweighed, that we should close Gitmo, that the
So,
risk...
so the innocent people who are going to lose their lives because of this, they're just part of the equation.
No, sir, there are risks...
I'm
either-
sorry, I want to tell you this much. As far as I'm concerned, if one child is saved because she would have been blown up by someone who's being released, it's better to keep all 90 of those people in Gitmo. And this idea that the people of the world, oh, they're so upset with us that it's a recruiting vehicle, that we've kept terrorists who murder innocent people in Gitmo. Well, you know what? I think that the bigger recruiting tool today is when our government, especially this administration, is perceived as being weak. I think terrorists are recruited not because we've held other terrorists in prison, but because we look like we're weak and cannot deal with the challenge. This disgusts me. Thank you very much.
We go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wolosky, yesterday I returned from Cuba with President Obama's delegation where we discussed the opening of U.S.-Cuban relations. While we have made steps toward developing positive bilateral relations, President Castro has repeatedly stated that relations with the United States will never be fully normal so long as the United States occupies or utilizes the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. How do you imagine the continued use of the Guantanamo Bay detention facility would affect the process of normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba?
Thank you, ma'am. As the President has said, this administration has no plans to leave, to turn over the base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. We are intent, as you know, to close the detention facility at that base. We would expect to continue to use the base for dealing with mass migration contingencies, and also to support Coast Guard operations with respect to counter-drug operations in the region.
Okay. To what extent do you believe this local diplomatic security could contribute to advancing our national security efforts?
Well, as you know, President Obama feels firmly that closing Guantanamo is in the national security interest of the United States. No detainee is transferred from Guantanamo absent a certification from the Secretary of Defense that the specific transfer will further the national security of the United States. And as I said in my opening statement, President Obama was hardly the first U.S. president to conclude that closing Guantanamo was in the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States. The first president to do that was the man who opened it up, George W. Bush, who concluded that it was a propaganda tool and a distraction to our allies. Not only did he believe that, he acted on it in transferring over 500 detainees from Guantanamo to third countries. So we believe, as did President Bush, as did numerous former secretaries of state of both parties, same for secretaries of defense, same for three former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and numerous retired flag officers, that closing Guantanamo will, on balance, enhance our national security. As we have said, you cannot live life without risk, and the proper analysis, as Congressman Engel suggested, we believe is balancing the risks of keeping it open versus the risks of closing it. We work diligently to prevent re-engagement. We've been quite successful in this administration in preventing re-engagement, and even one detainee returning to the fight is too many. But the proper analysis is balancing closure, the risks of closure, versus the risks of keeping it open. And I would point out that obviously our hearts go out to the people of Belgium today, and our hearts went out to the people of Paris just a few short months ago. But the continued maintenance of the facility at Guantanamo Bay did not prevent either of those attacks. There are, unfortunately, going to be acts of terrorism, probably whether the facility is opened or closed. The proper analysis is what are the risks of keeping it open in light of the very obvious use of that facility as a propaganda tool, which frankly you should not have to question. ISIL, which has now claimed responsibility for the Belgium attacks, uses Guantanamo as a propaganda tool. There's no question about this. We've all seen images of prisoners taken by ISIL being executed wearing orange jumpsuits that we believe are meant to mimic and evoke Guantanamo jumpsuits. There's no question that this is being used as a propaganda tool, as President Bush himself concluded when he determined to close the facility.
I'm running out of time, so thank you. I yield back.
Okay, Matt Salmon of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As long as we're talking about Cuba policy, I've got something I'd like to get off my chest. I find the imagery of the president yucking it up with FARC terrorists at a baseball game yesterday when Europe is under siege by terrorists disgusting, absolutely disgusting. And I believe that, well, I'm not going to go on that. I just think there are better things that I think the public should be seeing. One of the troubling aspects of the transfer of 6 detainees to Uruguay was the Sloan letter. The letter assuring the Uruguayan government that none of the detainees had ever been associated with terrorism. We know this isn't true. And I know it was your predecessor who wrote the letter. But can you walk us through how the administration could make such a misleading statement? How couldn't you expect a host government to then take seriously the monitoring and mitigation of the detainee? In Uruguay's case, the government stated ahead of time they would not monitor, and we still release them. Does this speak to the administration's overall willingness to accept greater risk in pursuit of the president's political goal to empty the prison? Mr. Wolosky.
Sure. Yes, sir. Thank you. First, although we cannot speak in an open session about the specifics of the security assurances that have been agreed to with any one country, I can assure you that any public statements that you may have just referenced are not accurate, and we do have security assurances with Uruguay. We briefed this committee in closed session on those security assurances, and we're happy to come and brief you about what they are and how they're being implemented. As to the Sloan letter, what I can tell you is that the conclusions in the Sloan letter mirrored the conclusions reached by the EOTF process, which was the process put in place at the beginning of this administration to carefully review all reasonably available information to the U.S. government with respect to a particular detainee. That process was described in some detail in my written submission. It involved dozens of national security professionals from all relevant agencies and departments of the government, including the intelligence community, many of them career professionals, and they reached certain conclusions about each detainee and the information then available to the United States about each detainee. So what the Cliff Sloan letter does is it tracks the conclusion of the EOTF report, which was this comprehensive interagency review that was conducted for the specific purpose of analyzing the available information in the U.S. government about each detainee and then making a disposition recommendation about that detainee.
Whatever justification you're trying to make for why the letter, though inaccurate, was sent doesn't really provide a lot of comfort to most of us. The fact is, it was flat out wrong. It was an error, and a gross error. In an interview recently with NPR, you said that after having visited Guantanamo Bay, you felt the detention center was better, certainly, than any state or local correctional facility or prison you visited, and better than many of the federal facilities. Yet you're advising the President on the closure of this facility so he can propose building a new facility here. Does that make any sense? Would it not be better to tell the American people and the world the real story about the facility, that it's a model detention facility, that the International Committee of Red Cross, ICRC, has a regular access to it? Wouldn't it be best to dispel the false narrative that some use rather than close down what, by your estimation, is a great facility?
Well, I do think it's a professionally run and a humanely run facility, and in particular, the servicemen and women who serve there face enormous hardship in their service, and they do an outstanding job in running the facility. General Kelly did an outstanding job in managing that. Now Admiral Tidd has taken over that process, and they both do an incredible job in maintaining a top, what is a very well-run facility. That said, we still think it should be closed.
We're going to Greg Meeks of New York and then Mo Brooks of Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get first a couple of things straight, for the record. As I listened, and my heart goes out to those individuals who lost their lives recently in Belgium, and as well as, we talk about the Paris attacks often, and you talk, but I just want to make sure that everyone in the record is clear that this war is not just against the West. We don't talk about all of the attacks that has taken place in various places. It's taken place, and we should be just as concerned in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Turkey. So to think that these are all human lives, and we've got to be concerned about all of those lives, not just in one area, and it's not just against us. It's not just against Christians, because when you look at that, Muslims have been killed also by these thugs, and that should be properly noted. And it should also be clear, and I think that the historical record is clear, that in acts of fear, when we act out of fear, our nation have made monumental mistakes in keeping Gitmo in operation out of fear, because that's what I'm hearing. Folks are saying out of fear we need to keep Gitmo open, would be yet another monumental mistake that one hurts America's interest rather than helps it. What comes straight to mind is we acted out of fear when we put the Japanese into internment camps. And so therefore, I caution us. And then after it happens, then we say, oh, look at our past, or we try to not talk about what we did. And so history gives us a reminder of what we should or should not be doing in this place, and calmer heads and better heads as opposed to acting out of fear and emotion. So I just think that the record should be clear on that, and it should be clear that all kinds of lives have lost in all parts of the world. And so this is a threat to everybody, not just to the West, not just to Christians, but to everybody. And that's why we've got to band together and work together in a cooperative manner. That being said, let me ask a quick question. Is where do we go? If the Guantanamo detention facility is closed, we close them, would you tell us what will the United States do when we capture terrorist suspects in the future? Do we have other adequate facilities for these individuals, and how would the administration approach the future capture, detention, and interrogation of high-level ISIS commanders?
Thank you, sir. We do believe we have the facilities. Any future captures would be considered on a case-by-case basis, and we'd consider whether the host nation could detain them or whether there'd be a disposition under prosecution, either Article 3, possibly military commissions. But we believe we have the ability, as we've shown in 1 or 2 cases in Iraq recently, to detain people and then turn them over to the host country. But it's on a case-by-case basis.
So there is a clear and concrete plan on how we would do this.
Yes, sir.
That's evident. Now let me ask also, I was listening to some of the debate earlier, and there was a question about recidivism rates. And I guess, according to the official reports from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that fewer than 5% of the detainees are transferred by the Obama administration are confirmed to have engaged in terrorist attacks. But I did hear I think it was Chairman Royce talk about, they used a re-engagement rate that is 30%. Now, is the 30, how, can you describe how you make that determination? How are those rates determined, and why is there such a disparity?
Well, I'll let the chairman speak for himself, but I think that
Will the gentleman yield? I will speak, because it's confirmed and suspected, and you're leaving out suspected.
not in this administration, respectfully, sir. The rate of suspected in this administration is 8.3%.
No, that's the exact numbers that I concur are right, and the overall numbers are over 30% overall. And 8.9 confirmed and suspected, and as explained to us, the investigators say it takes about 4 years lead time in order to get the confirmation, all of the confirmation. I'm just explaining. I'll yield back.
There were over 530 detainees transferred during the previous administration. Obviously, we cannot speak to the circumstances under which those detainees were transferred. First, how was a decision made to transfer them? Second, how was a decision made to transfer them to a specific country? Third, what assurances, if any, did the previous administration obtain from the third country to keep us and them safe? We can't speak to that. All we can do is speak to what we are doing in this administration.
And that's what I want you to do. Speak
what we are doing in this administration is at both stages of the process. First, making a determination in principle that a detainee may be approved for transfer and designated as such. And second, transferring him to a specific country subject to specific and detailed security assurances. What we are doing is very thorough. It's interagency. It's very comprehensive, and it takes a long time. It's described at length in my written testimony. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But the results of it, as set forth in the OD&I report from this month, are clear. The results of it are, first, confirmed re-engagement, 7 out of 144. That's 4.9%. Suspected, 12 out of 144. That's 8.3%. Those are what the numbers are, sir, for this administration. I'd point out also that with respect to the standards that are applied in defining what it even means to be confirmed or suspected, it's important to point out, first, that confirmed is a preponderance of information standard. So this is not a reasonable doubt. This is not that we are 100%.
The gentleman's time's expired. If I could just go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for his questions, and then maybe a question from Mr. Trott and Mr. Connolly.
I have more of a statement, and I appreciate it. You know, to start with, when we speak about closing Guantanamo, I'm glad to hear you on the record backing up the administration said that they will not transfer the naval base back to Cuba. We're talking about the detention center only. There's 2 entities there, as we're all aware of. As far as a recruiting tool, the Guantanamo Bay is a recruiting tool. I don't see how, I think that's a weak argument, because if those people come to the United States, is that not a recruiting tool too? So to say that they're in Guantanamo is going to be a stronger recruiting tool, I think, is sophistry at its finest, because the jihadis are going to look at them being here in the belly of the great Satan. So I think that argument's very weak, and we shouldn't even talk about that. And I disagree with your comments about the Uruguay 6. I just came back there and met with their foreign minister. They don't have a clue of what that negotiation was when it was negotiated under President Mujica. They don't know what the deals were, what the conditions were. They don't have a clue of monitoring, and I think it's a joke. But saying that, I think the overall success rate, if there were 780 total detainees, we're down to 94% have been processed. That leaves only 6%, and of those 6%, there's that's taken out the 36%, or the 36 that have already been cleared, yet this administration hasn't found them a suitable place to go. And I would encourage you to move a little bit quicker on that. And of the remaining 52%, if we take the 30% that we know will go into combat against our young men and women or suspected, that comes out to be 15.6 terrorists back fighting our young men and women. And I don't think any American would want that, or people around the world. And I'm going to yield the rest of my time back to Mr. Trott, if that's okay.
Yeah, we're going to have one question from Mr. Trott and one question from Mr. Connolly.
So thank you. Thanks, the gentleman from Florida. So if we move the detainees to U.S. soil, that's not going to be used as a recruitment tool by ISIS? They're going to go silent and now that we've done right by our allies?
It still will be a tool, but we take away, as from a legal point of view, we're taking away the issue that our allies are asking us to do. They're saying close Gitmo. So
You
there
think
was
our
still-
allies' chance are going to change their position in light of Brussels and Paris, like was suggested earlier? Isn't there a chance, would you agree, that there's a chance they will change their position with respect to our activities in Gitmo in light of recent events?
Sir, it's been a continuing position that they want Gitmo closed, that our leadership and the Bush administration leadership said that the costs of Gitmo outweigh the benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Trott. Now we go to Mr. Connolly for his question.
Mr. Wolosky or Mr. Lewis, do you remember the CIA terrorist incident a number of years ago in Fairfax County?
Yes, sir.
Was the perpetrator of that terrorist incident caught and tried?
It's my understanding, yes.
Was he tried in Guantanamo or was he tried in U.S. District Court right here in Virginia?
It's my understanding U.S. District Court here in Virginia.
And was he sentenced?
It's my understanding, yes, sir.
He received a death sentence, as a matter of fact, did he not?
That I do not know personally. I know it's a severe sentence.
Yeah. And somehow our system of justice worked, not on Cuban soil, on Virginian soil. We could handle a terrorist and did. I just, for the record, you know, we have to take into account the consequences of the symbolism of Guantanamo, and frankly, the fact that the suggestion is planted that we're not all that confident in our own system of justice in handling terrorist cases. And the fact of the matter is we do have experience and our system worked. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. We have votes on the floor. We appreciate the time of our witnesses this morning. Our witnesses have agreed to meet with us in April in closed session, so we appreciate that. As you have heard, there are many concerns with the President's plan, especially given the ever-growing terrorist threat, as evidenced by what happened in Brussels this week. The points made by Mr. Trott and by Mr. Yoho bring to mind a conversation I had yesterday with the former NSA and CIA director about the concept that if you move them to U.S. soil, in fact, that will be a magnet for terrorists. The fact that jihadists are being held in the United States, and so I think the last questions raised were also questions worth contemplating. But we will adjourn at this time for the votes, and we thank our panel.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, for me too.